Welcome to the world of science fiction. I am Adam, your narrator, where extraordinary tale come to life. Enjoy the journey. The debris field hung in the vacuum like a shattered constellation. Jagged shards of metal spun lazily in the weightless void, reflecting the dim glow of a nearby dying star. The wreckage was fresh bits of still charged plasma flickered among the ruins, sending tiny blue-white arcs of energy crawling over twisted holes of what had once been ships. Naik Reeve sighed as she leaned back in the pilot's chair, running a hand through her short auburn hair. She'd seen plenty of wrecks before, but something about this one set her nerves on edge. Maybe it was the eerie silence of it, or the way the largest chunk of hull still bore an insignia she didn't recognize. Blackened and half melted, but unmistakably alien. Her ship, the Nightingale, was a second-hand freighter that had seen better days. Okay, fine. Decades. The engine made an unsettling grinding noise when she pushed it past sublight. The she fields were about as reliable as a drunk's promises, and the life support system had a habit of randomly fluctuating just to keep her on her toes. But for all its quirks, the old bird had never let her down completely. "All right, sweetheart," Na murmured, flipping a few switches. "Let's see what we've got here." A slow pass over the wreckage showed no active distress signals, but her scanners picked up something unusual, a faint energy signature coming from what looked like an intact escape pod. Na narrowed her eyes. If the thing had power, there was a chance someone was still inside. She exhaled through her nose. "Well, guess I'm playing the Good Samaritan today." Maneuvering carefully, she extended the ship's grappling arm, locking onto the escape pod and pulling it into the cargo bay with a metallic clunk. The moment it was inside, her onboard AI, a pragmatic program named Juniper, chimed in over the intercom. "Salvage acquired. Initial scan detects one life form within the pod. Vital signs present but unstable." Na was already halfway out of her seat. "Prepped the medbay. Junie, medical protocols initiated. I feel obligated to remind you that our last supply run left us critically short on can it. Junie, if someone's in there, I'm not leaving them to die." The AI fell silent, though Nika swore she could feel Juniper's disapproval following her down to the cargo bay. The pod sat in the middle of the deck, its surface scorched and pitted with battle damage. The emergency lights on its side flickered weakly. Whatever had happened to the owner, it hadn't been pleasant. With a hiss of depressurization, NAA pried open the hatch. Inside, curled against the pod's interior, was a woman. No, not a woman, something that looked similar but decidedly alien. She was tall. Taller than NAA, even in her current slumped position. Her skin was an unusual shade, a deep indigo that seemed to catch the light in ways that made it look almost metallic. Iridescent scales covered her temples and followed the line of her jawbone, but it was her eyes, now fluttering open, that made Na's breath catch. They were entirely silver, with no visible pupils or irises, and they reflected the dim cargo bay lights like mirrors. A Veroi, NAA swore under her breath. The VXY were infamous throughout the known systems, fierce, disciplined, raised from birth to be warriors and strategists. If there was one species you didn't want to piss off, it was them. And yet here was one half dead in her cargo bay. She ran a quick scan with her handheld med device. Multiple fractures, a deep plasma burn along her rib cage. Internal bleeding. She needed treatment. "Now great," Na muttered. "I just had to pick up the scary one." Lifting her was no easy Task she was heavier than she looked all. Lean muscle and dense bone structure now. Managed to haul her to the medbay. Without dropping her, which she counted as a win as she set her down on the exam table. The Versi stirred a low pained growl slipping from between her lips now. Hesitated. She treated her fair share of injuries over the years when you ran salvage on the fringes of civilized space. You learned to patch yourself up real quick, but she'd never worked on a Veroi before. She had no idea how their biology compared to humans. Okay, she said mostly to herself. Let's see if I can fix you up without getting stabbed in the process. As she reached for the medical kit, the Vero's eyes snapped open for a moment. They were unfocused, scanning the room in confusion. Then faster than should have been possible for someone in her condition. She lunged. Na barely had time to jerk backward before the alien had a blade. Where the hell had she been hiding? A blade pressed against her throat. Her grip was weak, her limbs trembling, but her intent was clear. She bared her teeth in a snarl, revealing sharp incisors. Where am I? Her voice waso but sharp as the knife she held. Na held up her hand slowly. My ship. The Ver's silver eyes narrowed. I found your escape pod. Na clarified, very aware of the blade resting way too close to her cord artery. You were half dead. I was trying to help. The VXY didn't move. Didn't blink. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she let out a breath and slumped backward onto the exam table. Knife slipping from her fingers. Now exhaled. Okay, that was fun. The VXY didn't respond. Her eyelids fluttered, her breathing uneven. Na realized she was fighting unconsciousness. Hey, she said, nudging her shoulder gently. You need to stay awake. At least until I finish patching you up. Otherwise I'm going to have to drag your unconscious ass back to the scanner again, and I'd really rather not throw my back out today. The Veroi made a sound that might have been a scoff. Fine, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Fix me. Naa smirked, reaching for the med spray. See, now that's the kind of gratitude I like to hear. The Vixie cracked one eye open, her gaze still sharp despite her exhaustion. Keep talking, human, and I will stab you. Naa just grinned. You say that, but you're already too weak to hold a knife. Give me 5 minutes, she chuckled, shaking her head as she continued treating the wounds. This was going to be interesting. Naa had dealt with a lot of difficult passengers over the years, smugglers with itchy trigger fingers, deaded gamblers who thought they could charm their way out of paying, one particularly aggressive diplomat who tried to steal her cargo, but nothing compared to dealing with a stubborn Veroi warrior who had just woken up from near death and seemed personally offended by the concept of being taken care of. The Versi sat on the exam table, arms crossed over her bandaged torso, glaring at Na as though sheer force of will could burn a hole through her skull. She'd barely been awake for an hour, but in that time Naa had been accused of poisoning her, interrogating her and her personal favorite, trying to weaken her spirit by feeding her soup. It's just food, Naa had said, exasperated. After the Varric, he spent 5 solid minutes analyzing the bowl like it might contain some kind of slow-acting neurotoxin. I don't eat human food, she had shot back. Na had raised an eyebrow. Yeah, what do Varric eat then? Meat, protein, energy-dense sustenance meant for warriors. Na had stared at her for a long moment, then leaned forward, resting her elbows on the counter. It's chicken soup. Chicken is meat. Last I checked, the Versi had looked down at the spoon like it was a Weapon she had never been trained to wield, then very reluctantly she had taken a single careful sip. The resulting expression had been a mixture of confusion, weary approval, and reluctant surrender. Now the Veroi was still scowling, but at least she had eaten half the bowl. Na took that as a victory, so she said, leaning against the medbay counter, "Are we going to talk about why I found you floating in a busted escape pod in the middle of nowhere, or do I just get to keep guessing?" The Verk's gaze snapped to hers, her entire body tensing. She was still weak from her injuries, but the way she moved, the way her muscles coiled like a spring, told Na she was always ready for a fight. Even now Na held up her hands. "Hey, relax, just making conversation. I owe you no explanations." "Human right, because that be too easy." Na sighed, rubbing a hand down her face. "Look, I don't need your life story, I just need to know if you've got people coming after you, or if I need to start making evasive maneuvers the next time I hit a populated sector." Na had never considered herself a particularly patient person. Years of running solo salvage missions had accustomed her to the quiet efficiency of working alone, making decisions without debate and answering to no one but herself. Having a Vixie warrior on board was rapidly testing the limits of that solitary lifestyle. "You're going to blow out the compression coil if you keep running the engine that hot," Thea said, her silvery eyes fixed on the control panel as NAA pushed the nail through a dense asteroid field. Na's jaw tightened. "Been flying this ship for 8 years. Think I know how to handle her?" 8 years of incorrect operation, Thea muttered just loud enough for Na to hear. "You know what?" Na swiveled her chair to face her unexpected passenger. "If you're so concerned with how I fly, maybe you'd prefer to go back to your escape pod. I'm sure it's very cozy." Thea's expression remained impassive, but Na caught the slight tensing of her shoulders. 3 days had passed since she pulled the Veroi from the wreckage, and while Thea's physical wounds were healing with remarkable speed, VXY regeneration was apparently something to behold. Her emotional walls remained firmly intact. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle hum of the ship systems and the occasional ping of the proximity sensors as they navigated the field. Finally Thea spoke, her voice softer than Na had heard it before. "Your hospitality is appreciated." NAA blinked, genuinely surprised. She hadn't expected anything resembling gratitude from her stoic passenger. "Well, don't strain yourself with excessive thanks." That earned her the faintest hint of what might have been a smile, quickly suppressed. "Among my people to need rescue is to admit weakness," Thea explained, her silver eyes now focused on the stars beyond the viewport. "And weakness is unforgivable." Na considered this, her fingers drumming absently on the console. "Sounds like a lonely way to live." "We are not concerned with loneliness, only strength, honor, and duty." Thea recited the words like they'd been drilled into her since birth, with which NAA suspected they probably had been. "And which one of those got you stuffed in an escape pod?" Na asked, turning back to the controls. Thea fell silent again, and NAA sighed, realizing she'd pushed too far. The very clearly had secrets, and while part of NAA was burning with curiosity, another part understood the value of privacy all too well. "Look," she said, adjusting their course slightly to avoid a particularly dense cluster of asteroids. "We heading to a refueling station about 6 hours from here. It's small, mostly automated, but they've got decent supplies. We can stock up. I can Drop you wherever you want to go and we can both pretend this never happened. Thea's reflection in the viewport was unreadable. That would be optimal. Great. NAA said, ignoring the unexpected twinge of disappointment in her chest. Optimal. It is the Nightingale's engine room was a cramped, sweltering chamber filled with mismatched parts and jury-rigged solutions. A mechanical testament to Na's years of making do with whatever she could salvage or afford. She was on her back beneath the main coolant system, trying to reach a particularly stubborn valve, when a shadow fell across her workspace. Your thermal regulator is operating at 68% efficiency, Thea stated, crouching down to peer at Nika's work. Yeah, well, replacement parts don't exactly grow on trees in deep space. NAA grunted, straining to turn the valve with her wrench. And unless you've got a spare regulator hidden in those skin-tight warrior clothes of yours, move aside before Nika could protest. Thea had slipped into the narrow space beside her, their bodies pressed uncomfortably close in the confined area. The VXY reached up, her indigo fingers deftly manipulating the components that Na had been struggling with. These connections are corroded, Thea said, her voice matter of fact. The alloy used in standard human equipment is sufficient for the heat load you're generating. Nico was finding it difficult to focus on the technical details with Thea's face just inches from her own. This close she could see faint luminescent patterns on the Varick skin. Subtle markings that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. I can reconfigure this system, Thea continued, oblivious to nunk distraction, but I will need tools and materials. Na swallowed hard. I've got a toolkit in the storage locker and some scrap wrap metal that might work good. Fetch them any other time. Na would have bristled at being ordered around on her own ship, but there was something in Thea's focused determination that quelled her usual defiance. With an awkward shimmy, she extracted herself from beneath the coolant system and went to retrieve the supplies. When she returned, Thea had already disassembled half the thermal regulator, laying out components in a meticulous pattern on the floor grating. You know, NAA said, setting down the toolkit. Most people ask before they start taking apart someone else's ship. Thea glanced up, those silver eyes reflecting the engine room's harsh lighting. Would you have agreed? Probably not. Then asking would have been inefficient. Na couldn't help but laugh. You know, for a supposedly honor-bound warrior race, you have an interesting relationship with permission. Honor does not preclude practicality, Thea replied. Select a tool from the kit with surgical precision. Besides, I am not entirely representative of my species. There was a weight to those words that caught Na's attention, an admission, however slight, that there was more to Thea's story than she had revealed. Before she could press further, the ship's alarm system blared to life. Warning, Juniper's calm voice announced over the intercom. Primary engine coolant pressure exceeding recommended levels. Engine shutdown imminent. Na scrambled to her feet, but Thea was already moving, her hands working with blinding speed as she reconnected several components. The coolant bypass is failing, Thea said, her voice steady. Despite the escalating alarms, we need to redirect the flow manually or the engine will overheat. NAA Dove for the emergency toolkit on the wall, extracting a manual bias valve here. Can you install it while I try to regulate the pressure from the main controls? Thea nodded, once snatching the valve from Naik's hands. Their fingers brushed momentarily, and despite the crisis, Na was startled by the electric warmth of The contact. No time for that now. She sprinted to the small auxiliary control panel on the engine room wall, frantically inputting commands to slow the buildup of pressure. The ship shuddered ominously around them. Juniper brought all available power to the auxiliary cooling systems. NAA shouted, routing the AI responded, warning auxiliary cooling systems are operating at minimal capacity due to previous power conservation protocols. Override those protocols. Junie, now behind her, Thea worked with methodical intensity, her movements precise despite the urgency of their situation. Sweat beaded on her indigo skin, highlighting those strange luminescent patterns that NAA had noticed earlier. The bypass is in place, Thea announced after what felt like an eternity. Open the secondary flow valves. NAA didn't hesitate, trusting Thea's expertise despite having only known her for 3 days. She punched in the command sequence, holding her breath as the ship groaned in protest for a terrible moment. Nothing happened. The alarms continued to wail. The pressure readings continued to climb, and Na's heart hammered against her ribs. Then slowly, inexorably, the pressure gauge began to fall. Coolant pressure stabilizing, Juniper reported, her synthetic voice somehow managing to sound relieved. Engine temperature decreasing to nominal levels. NAA sagged against the control panel, exhaling a shaky breath that was too close. Thea rose to her feet, wiping her hands on a rag. Her silver eyes met Nick's, and for the first time the Vero's expression held something other than cold detachment or disdain. There was respect there, and perhaps a hint of something else. Your ship requires significant maintenance, she said, but the usual edge of criticism was missing from her voice. Yeah, well, Na pushed herself upright, running a hand through her sweat dampened hair. Keeping her running is a full-time job, and the pay is terrible. A sound escaped Thea, so brief, so unexpected that NAA almost missed it. A laugh, small and rusty as if from disuse, but unmistakably a laugh. The moment hung between them, fragile and new. Then Thea cleared her throat, her expression returning to its usual controlled neutrality, though perhaps not quite as severe as before. I can assist with the repairs, she offered, until we reach the refueling station. NAA studied her for a long moment, nodding the way. Thea's gaze now met hers directly instead of sliding away. Something had shifted between them. A barrier broken, or at least cracked. I'd appreciate that, she said finally, allowing herself a small smile. Though fair morning, June's got a whole list of things that need fixing, and we've only got 6 hours. Then we should begin immediately, Thea replied, already turning back to the disassembled thermal regulator. This system will need complete reconfiguration. Nico watched her for a moment, struck by how natural it felt to have Thea working alongside her despite the rocky start to their acquaintance. There was something compelling about the Vero's focused intensity, her quiet competence. You know, Nick said, kneeling beside Thea to help with the reassembly. For someone who's supposedly just a warrior, you sure know your way around a thermal regulator. Thea's hands stilled briefly, then resumed their work. As I said, I'm not entirely representative of my species. Care to elaborate on that? NAA asked, passing her a socket wrench. Thea accepted the tool, her fingers brushing Nickus again, and this time Naik was certain the contact lingered a fraction longer than necessary, perhaps. Thea said softly, those silver eyes meeting Nickus with unexpected openness. But not yet. NAA nodded, a strange flutter of anticipation warming her chest fair. Enough, we've got time, the words fell.